Oh, you do? I didn't know that you could do that. Thank you, Rebecca. You know way more about Zoom than I do. So this is our second discussion on breastfeeding. In the first discussion, we talked a little bit about, when people start making breast milk, or like human milk is kind of what I've been referring to, and about antenatal expression of milk, like sort of getting prepared for when baby comes and how that can be helpful. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about the initial days after baby's born and sort of what happens with just sort of what happens in that first week, basically. And there's going to be more discussions on other things that happen in the first week, but this will be just sort of like the foundations of, sort of what's going on with our bodies and what's would be considered quote unquote normal for first week for lactation. But before I start, I just wanted to check in and see if you guys had any specific questions that you wanted to ask either about the last session, Lindsay, or if you were coming to today's session with something that you felt like you really wanted to talk about, then we could do that first or do it in addition to what we're going to be doing today.
If I came to the first breastfeeding session.
Oh, I thought you were there. Maybe you were at another session and I was just thinking it was breastfeeding because I feel like.
Yeah, I think it was someone from Hazelton, but I can't remember her name now. And Lindsay's from Smithers.
Oh, okay. But you've been to a session before because I totally recognize your name and it was in Smithers. Yeah, okay. Okay, sorry, I thought it was the breastfeeding one. Yeah. Did either of you come with something specific that you were hoping to talk about today?
I actually didn't even know what the session was about, so.
Okay.
But this is a good refresher, so I'm actually happy that this is the topic.
Oh, good, awesome, okay.
Yeah, and same for me. I kind of just quickly looked at what was going to be talked about for milk changes,
Okay.
and that's exactly what I'm interested in, so this will be perfect.
Okay, awesome. And if I don't cover as much in depth or kind of where you were hoping to go with like quote unquote the milk changes, I'm happy to come back and send something to you after or bring it to the next session. Because the focus is mostly on the first week, we might not get through like all the different changes that are going to happen. And I'm certainly didn't necessarily plan to get down to like the detail, like there's this percentage of this or that or whatever, but I obviously have that information tucked away somewhere. I don't have it memorized and I can bring it back, but I'm mostly was going to focus on just like generally speaking, and I'm trying to do the discussion in an approach that would be easy to replicate towards like other, like in your practice. So if you're talking to new parents, that the language is kind of the same. Hey, Mel.
Hi.
I assumed that you'd be at the NRP changes talk, so I wasn't sure.
Yeah, I've got us at 2 computers on in Golden right now, so.
Oh my gosh, doubling up. Okay, I asked both Annika and Lindsay if there was anything specific that they wanted to ask before we get started with today's session. Was there anything that you had thought that you wanted to ask specifically before we get started?
No, we've just definitely had a run here of neonatal recesses, so I'm excited to solidify some things that we may have been doing in practice. So yeah.
Okay, cool. That will be for your other Zoom discussion. That's the mine is going to be more towards the breastfeeding, but we can get going with this. So I do have a slide that I was going to share. I think everyone on the call is probably familiar already with like the benefits of breastfeeding. I have just like a couple of slides on that. I might just point out a couple of things that are sometimes helpful when you're communicating with people who are planning on using human or are uncertain about how they're going to feed their babies. That might be helpful to point out, just like a different kind of perspective. So I'll just bring that up first. And then I'll share my screen. Okay, share screen, and it's going to be this one. So this is what I just mentioned. Everyone is already familiar with all of the recommendations for who are on the call today anyways. So we know all of this already, but I thought that sometimes this is helpful just for communications with families who are uncertain about feeding, how they're going to be feeding. So there's some risks of not using human milk. And because a lot of feedback from certain families is like they feel hit over the head with like why we're always saying like breastfeed, breastfeed, breastfeed. Sometimes kind of coming at it from, well, what would happen if I didn't choose to use human milk? Like sort of thinking of it just from a slightly different perspective. So it's not so much that we're not saying don't not breastfeed, but we're sort of saying, well, what would happen if you chose the other? These are some of the risks with that. So a lot of people know about the baby things, but I think one of the things that sometimes people forget to think about is like what the risk might be for the feeder. So people who are choosing to use human milk for feeding, they actually have lower risks of diabetes, breast cancer, and ovarian cancer, which I think those are common things that people may know just from passing and in public. You kind of hear that a lot. But I don't know that everybody knows that's actually very protective for postpartum depression. And that kind of might be a bit of a mind difference, because people might associate breastfeeding with like lack of sleep and therefore more risk for postpartum depression. But there's something hormonal that happens that's actually protective, that has been shown to be obviously beneficial to the feeder. And interestingly, you have a reduction in your risk of myocardial infarction if you breastfeed. So these are some real benefits to using human milk. And we know, like, part of the reason why we spend a lot of time trying to support people is that we know that providing education and giving support from professionals actually has a really positive influence on breastfeeding. But despite this, the number one factor that positively influences breastfeeding is actually partner support. So if you have a person who has a partner that you're working with, it is important that they are on the discussion, and that you're including them in all the information sharing that you're doing, like how to do latching, how often to feed, et cetera, because if they have support from friends and families and professionals, and they know all the information, and they're getting lots of reassurance, and you're building self-efficacy. If they are at home and their partner says, maybe we shouldn't breastfeed, you seem really tired, they will actually probably not breastfeed. So the partner support is really super key. Oops, sorry. Just going to try to move that screen. And I think these are some of the factors that you probably also are aware of. One thing that I just like to point out on this slide that people may or may not be aware of is that pacifier use in the first few months postpartum is associated with decreased rates of breastfeeding. And I just bring that forward because it's not uncommon for people to come to see you who might have a pacifier with them, or a really well-intentioned mother or mother-in-law who, let me put a pacifier in that baby's mouth. It's often just associated with people's sometimes what I would say, their discomfort of hearing a crying baby. The needs of babies at the beginning are super simple. They're not manipulative. They express themselves because they are hungry. And if you put something else in their mouth, you're going to miss feeding cues. So it's not surprising to me that the introduction of the pacifier in the first few months would negatively influence breastfeeding. It's not so much that it's nipple confusion or anything to do with that. It's mostly to do with the fact that you miss cues, and that parents just aren't aware that the baby's hungry because they're already sucking on something else. So this is the slide that I kind of wanted to get to, and I apologize if you guys are on the screen here. Rebecca, when you're using Zoom and like I'm sharing my screen like this, can you see your own pictures on the side as well? Like I'm seeing, like, can you see the participants and all their cameras, or is it just like the one set?
I can see, if I go to view options in gallery view, I can see, or side by side mode, I guess.
Right.
I can see everyone. Is that something that you'd like to do?
No, it's okay. It's just, I thought it was distracting because like I can see everyone on my screen, but I'm like, I'm sharing my screen. So is everyone seeing like duplicates of themselves? So
Not at this time, no.
not this. Okay, awesome. Okay, so the first week. So in the first week, there's a ton of changes that happen, like hormonally with the breast milk supply, when milk's coming in, when colostrum is in, obviously, and just it's all so perfectly timed with newborn behaviors that I think it's just worthwhile to go through and sort of talk about what that looks like. It's kind of like one of those things that you can't believe that it happens so well most of the time, because you know, if we tried to plan it out, it wouldn't work perfectly. So if we sort of think about the breastfeeding in the first week as really being a response to newborn behaviors, it also might be helpful, instead of just approaching it from like, this is what everybody's body does all the time, and focus more on the newborn. That sometimes can be helpful for parents too, because it's teaching them self-efficacy and to respond to their babies, but also letting them know that their dyad is independent of like the textbook and what's said that's supposed to happen with your body. So in the first 24 hours, you'll notice that like parents are like super content and very happy. They think they have this angel baby. They often will remark, my baby is so good, she's so great. They sort of put some values on the baby right away. And if they're in the hospital, you know, this is the point when if you're working in the hospital yourself, this is often when you're working with people, you'll notice that you know, parents are pretty content and they're not too super keen on going to sleep because they think that this is their baby. There's a bit of a sense of like permanency with people when they first have their babies, that like what is presenting is what it's going to be the entire time, when in fact, as we all probably know, babies change a lot every single day and that nothing really lasts forever. So we don't want to take away their joy, but we also want to point out, like whenever possible, to say, oh, this is what your baby's doing right now. So just start building that expectation that this is not a permanent state. This is what your baby's doing right now, and this is what they're trying to tell you, sort of thing. That might be a helpful sort of tip for you to take. If they're still in the hospital on day 2, parents start to notice that there's baby that they had in the first day, things are changing. And people's immediate response is like, well, there must be something wrong. Like the baby must be gassy, or the baby must be constipated, or I'm not making enough milk, if they aren't understanding, you know, how the colostrum process is. And they start to become a bit more uncertain. And this is a stage where they're more influenced, I guess, by what other people are saying to them. So if they're in the hospital, that's really great, because you know they're around us and yourselves, and they're getting accurate information. But if they've gone home, you can imagine this is where the well-meaning and well-intentioned family members might mention something, and it might set them on this crash course. So I would just say, like, again, if before people leave, like obviously there's a lot of education that's provided to people. If you have the luxury of having people who are going to be seeing these individuals, you know, in the first few days before day 7, just give enough information to get them through to when they're going to see somebody next, so they're not super overwhelmed, and that they can remember that information, especially in the point when they're feeling really uncertain and somebody says, why don't you just use a pacifier? In their brain, if they've only been given enough information to get them to when they're seeing someone next, they're more likely to remember than if we've given them like all the information that they need to know for the first year of life, sort of thing. On day 3, most people are at home by this point. This is a terrible day for people. There's a huge hormone shift. So after the placenta is is born, there's a huge decrease in the amount of progesterone in the body. And so what happens is that is a cue for your body to start with the milk production. And obviously that it takes a few days for that to start happening. But on day 3, there's usually enough of a buildup of the hormone prolactin and enough of a dip in the progesterone that people have this major hormonal shift, and they are going to start to, if they haven't already, start to fill with milk in their breasts. And that's usually associated with a huge mood swing. So they like 3-day blues is sometimes what they call it. Some people will actually have like almost flu-like symptoms, feel achy, their breasts might be warm. If they are starting to get milk really quickly, they'll obviously be engorged at that point. It's a really tough day for people. It's also a day that if I'm seeing somebody and they're not crying, that I'm like, their milk obviously hasn't come in, because you're not having a hormone shift and you're not probably as upset as I would anticipate you being. On day 5, people are generally completely exhausted, but their milk is in at that point. And it's usually in enough that baby has enough flow and it's easy for them to be feeding pretty frequently. If at this point they have been having trouble with the latch though, their nipples might be very sore. So that is something that might be noted. And then usually by the end of the week, if they've had some success with latching and if they are not in too much pain, things are starting to look a little bit better. So a key day here is this period between day 2 and 3. On this particular day, what we would anticipate is that in an effort to assist with the breast milk production, which is going to be happening hormonally anyway, baby has cueing that they give to the body to say, yeah, like I need milk. And they have what's called like the second night. So you've probably heard of the second night already in your practice, but just in case you haven't, that is a newborn behavior that is super frantic and completely exhausting for parents, can last anywhere from 6 to 12 hours, where the baby is on and off the breast. Sometimes they are achieving a latch, most times they are not. And they are sometimes biting at the nipple, licking at the nipple. They're definitely crying a lot. And if somebody isn't aware of that, number one, they will feel like they're not doing a good job because they're not achieving a latch, not realizing that they're probably not going to get a latch every single time. Number two, they're going to think something's potentially wrong with their baby, which is a really common thing that happens. People say, oh, there's something wrong, the baby's gassy, I'm doing something wrong. And then the last thing that can happen is that people think that the baby is acting that way because they're quote unquote starving, and then provide an alternate source of nutrition to the baby, therefore stopping the newborn behavior and therefore delaying all of the stimulation that's needed in order to bring in the milk. And then they'll have that day two again, another night and another night until the breast milk fully comes in. So it's really important to be supportive to people and to be reasonable here. It's like giving information that, first of all, that this is a really tough night from a newborn behavior perspective, and that people should anticipate that is really helpful to people. But then expecting them to sit for 12 hours while the baby is like acting like that is not super reasonable for some people. So I usually just let people know that they should expect it, to try to be with it as long as they can. If they need to step away from it, it's not the end of the world. If they need to give the baby to somebody else in the house and get out of the house so they can't even hear the baby crying, that is good self-care. What we want to try to avoid is giving like formula that would stop the behavior and therefore potentially delay the milk coming in the next day. And we also don't want to have a situation where you're not with the baby for most of that time. So taking breaks is fine, but you shouldn't be like, okay, I've done 2 hours of this, and now for the next 6 hours, I'm just going to go and do something else. It's better to kind of put the time in, if you will, as much as you can, so that you don't have to sort of continue to deal with it for the remainder of the week. So hopefully that makes sense. So yeah, so that day 3 is usually after they had that second night. What ends up happening is on day 3, after they're having that super fussy spell, baby goes to sleep, mom should definitely go to sleep because then they'll have more of a spike in their prolactin. And then hopefully they wake up and their breasts are either filling, or in most instances, like the body overdoes it and brings in too much milk and there's engorgement, which also leads to that feeling not great on day 3. So from a newborn behavior for baby perspective, in the first 24 hours, they are quite sleepy, and their stomachs are very, very small. And so it's anticipated that their behaviors are making people feel really good about their babies. So as you know, after the baby's born, they usually have quite an alert phase and might last up to 4 hours in some instances, but babies will sort of start to come to, and then if left on a mom just like laying on them, they will curl up and actually just latch onto the breast by themselves. And we're going to talk about that in another session about breast crawl and laid back breastfeeding. But in most hospitals, or in preference for parents too, they would like to latch the baby. And so when you do that, you're actually you're sort of interrupting a bunch of newborn reflexes that help them to latch and to get a latch. That's probably going to be really great. And there's nothing wrong with that. You just have to take that into consideration. So babies use pressure points on their limbs to feel security, to know that it's safe for them to sort of be positioned to latch on to the nipple, and they use their feet to sort of make movements, and they use smell in order to locate the areola as well as the nipple. And so if left to use their own reflexes, if they had all of those things, they would go ahead and latch. When we pick up a baby sideways, like for cross cradle, we're taking away those reflexes from the babies, and it makes them a little bit uncertain, and it means that people who are latching the baby have to sort of compensate for that. So without the security of having the pressure points on the knees, wrists, and ankles, people have to hold the baby more securely. Putting the baby's belly to the belly not only is good ergonomically for a baby to drink, but it also provides that extra sense of security that they are attached to something and it's safe for them to sort of go ahead and latch on. Holding their neck is necessary because if they were left to their own to actually latch on their own, the gravity would actually help to kind of keep their head in place in a more laid back area. But because we have them sideways, we have to do the work of sort of holding their head and controlling it. So when you're helping somebody to kind of get set up in that first few hours to breastfeed, it's good to, belly to belly, nose towards the nipple, and to realize that babies are touching their mouths and grabbing at the nipples because that's their smelling reflex of trying to locate the nipple. Having a little bit of expressed breast milk and touching kind of cues them that, okay, I'm in that area. If you sort of have them sitting there before that, they are going to do that grabbing. And the parents will always say, oh, why are they using their hands so much? It's so frustrating. It's like, it's just a normal newborn behavior that they need to do in order to locate things. And because of that, that's one of the reasons why it's good not to necessarily wash people before they breastfeed, because there's lots of smells there. Obviously with COVID, there's a need to sometimes do that, but if not, it's good to have a breastfeed before that. So after that initial breastfeed, the babies will usually fall asleep for quite a long period of time. And it might even be up to 12 hours. And this is normal for the first 24 hours. When babies wake up, they might feed 2 or 3 more times. And by the 24-hour mark, they really start to wake up. And that's sort of when they start feeding more often. So underneath here, you can see that I have, like, really in the first 24 hours, babies are feeding about 4 times, maybe 8. But a lot of our hospital protocols are to like get them feeding every 2 hours. There is benefit to having them feed more frequently. There's practice. It gives people, the ability to sort of practice latching and things like that. But the reality is the baby's not super interested. People are going to get frustrated. And it is nice to make people not frustrated and also not to create a problem when really there isn't one that necessarily exists. A baby who's more awake is going to be much easier to latch, obviously. And their capacity in their stomach is quite small. It's small to begin with, and it's usually filled with like amniotic fluid. And there's going to be a lot of spitting and sneezing and amniotic fluid coming out. And once that's more clear at the end of 24 hours, they do have a bit more room in there for eating. So from 24 hours to 72 hours, we've already gone over kind of that second night, but they do start to latch more frequently. And usually the direction, and I know this is part of education that you already provide, is to, feed them whenever they're awake. And if they're difficult to latch or it doesn't seem like they're interested in that, having them naked and skin to skin is still great stimulation. What some parents find is that having the baby on day 2 suddenly feels like your baby just doesn't have 2 arms and 2 legs. They're like little octopi with like all these different limbs, and they're trying to get coordinated and everything. And so a good capacity building piece is before they're leaving the hospital, when the baby is a little bit more, not as active, sort of discussing like ergonomics. So like getting some kind of system to help them to set up their baby so that they're well supported, their arms, that the baby's head's well supported. And also just to remember that a baby that's more awake is going to be easier to latch. So there is, unless there's a medical concern and there's a reason to put a baby on a schedule to eat at a certain frequency, letting the baby wake up on their own to eat, you will have better feeds than if you're constantly trying to wake a baby up on a clock. And it would, for a normal baby who doesn't have other things going on, so like isn't like post resuscitation or having other sort of concerning things that are going on, just like a regular baby that's been born, those babies are going to wake up on their own probably within 2.5 hours at the most. They're not going to continue to sleep past that in the second day. And as you know, overnight, they're like that second overnight or whatever, they're going to have a really prolonged period of being awake. On the third day, when the milk typically does come in, and obviously there's a range for that, and certainly there's people whose milk doesn't come in for an entire week, which is really tough. But on the third day, when milk does start to come in, babies will be much easier to latch in the sense there's a flow there, and so they're going to be more awake, and it's going to be easier for them to get feeding. But what is tough sometimes is that the breast shape is changed. So you have somebody who's been practicing latching for 2 whole days with a pretty soft breast, right? And that's nature's kindness to us, because it's easier to latch on that softer breast because we're breastfeeding, we're latching, on the breast itself. But on day 3, if the breasts are really engorged, it's like trying to latch onto a balloon. And so it can be really tough. And then babies end up on nipples. And because the milk is there, they're more than happy just to suck as much as possible and get all that milk. So, doing a bit of softening around the breast and having something for them to latch onto. So expression is helpful. That's a really great skill to teach in the first 24 hours. And that's one of our sessions will be about, different ways of getting milk out of the breast, including hand expression. That is like, people use hand expression a lot in the first week. And on day 3 is usually a day when people really start using it, because you want to sort of get that breast soft. And so once the milk is in, for sure by day 5, typically babies are going to want to eat. They kind of almost want to get back up to their birth weight. They're going to wake up on their own to do that feeding. So again, in a baby who doesn't have any other sort of compromising issues or confounding medical reasons that they need to be on a schedule, babies will wake up, and usually they feed between 12 and 14 times a day between day 3 and day 7. It is helpful to let parents know that unlike us, where we might be used to, for example, setting ourselves up with a certain size breakfast, a certain size lunch, and a certain size supper, and then have like 2 balanced snacks in between. Babies kind of determine how much volume they're going to take at each feed. It's never the exact same thing every time. And so sometimes people get sort of hung up on like, well, I just fed the baby, how can they be hungry again right now? They just, you know, maybe in that feed previously, they hadn't taken on the same volume. Perhaps they weren't actively eating the entire time, so they need a little bit of top up. A sort of a very typical pattern that you see is that, you know, babies eat first thing in the morning around 6 to 8 a.m. It's usually a really great feed because mom's been asleep, hopefully, you know, in the early morning hours when you really get a peak of that prolactin. So there's a lot of milk. It's super plentiful. It's flowing easily. Baby has an awesome feed. Then they feed a few more times in the morning, maybe between 10 and noon. Then they might fall asleep for 4 hours. And wake up in the late afternoon, have a couple of more feeds. Then in the evening, they have another fussy time, which is really common to have a fussy time every day. They feed at 10, they feed at 2, they feed at like 3 in the morning, and then that sort of repeats. And then they're not eating the same amount every time. They might be eating 5 meals at one feeding, 20 meals at another. And it doesn't really matter because overall, if they're eating between 12 and 14 times a day, the total volume for the day is going to be appropriate. Run into trouble when people are feeding their babies 8 times in 24 hours because people are in denial. Well, I just fed her like 10 minutes ago. She can't be hungry again. Feed her again. It counts as a feed, and the baby obviously needs it, and it will help to not only for baby to grow, but also to help them to get back to their birth weight when they're more likely to start sleeping for longer periods. And that means you can sleep for longer periods too. And then by the end of the week, if they are back to their birth weight, then usually they're a bit more content or close to there. And that's when you start to see babies who can have, when they're back to their birth weight, they tend to start sleeping for like up to 5 hours at a time. And that's okay if everything else obviously normal, like I said, so long as when they wake up, they're going to be feeding more frequently in their awake time. If they're in denial and not going to feed them, then having them sleep for 5 hours is not a great strategy. And the only other thing I forgot to mention was day 5 is when jaundice peaks in infants. So it's normal, obviously, for babies to have jaundice. And day 5 is usually the day that they're the most yellow. This is also the day that most people will have their breastfeeding established and in. And like I said, just such a, usually a perfect kind of system. That means there's going to be a lot more stooling, and that's how they're going to get rid of that jaundice anyway. So often by day 7, even a super yellow baby who has like a normal bilirubin will by day 7 often not be anywhere near as yellow, maybe just a little bit of jaundice left in their eye because they have quite a bit of pooping once the milk has come in. So I'm just going to stop because this is sort of like the summary just for the first week. And I just wanted to see if anybody had any questions or comments or, something that they wanted to share about what they've noticed in practice in the first week. I'm more than happy to talk about that here now.
Joyce, we would really like this graph printed in the rooms.
Yes.
And then we can explain. I think this is excellent though. And I think even especially there's a few of us in here, a couple of us have had kids it definitely breaks it down. Like it's very, it's really easy to understand, and it is really easy to kind of lay it out and see physiologically how all those things kind of happen at once between both mom and baby.
It's crazy. It's like a system that it seems very perfectly aligned. Obviously things are out of sorts. Like for example, in the first 24 hours can look a lot different if, somebody's had like a super long labor and maybe has had a lot of pain medication, and that first hour or 2 might look different for the baby, and there's more support that's needed there. But ultimately, once that's out of their system, it still flows along the same pathway. Even a baby who is got hyperbilirubinemia, you know, they're still following this pathway. It's just they have that added issue of having all that extra sleepiness. But if in the background, you can imagine like kind of what the behavior would typically be, it is helpful for supporting people. We do use this in our, in Golden anyways, we do use this discussion and slide in our group prenatal. And the feedback has been that it is kind of helpful to kind of know what's going to happen in the first week, because there's so many changes. Unlike later in the first year, you have more time like between how things change. The first week is like, it's different basically every 24 hours. So yeah, thanks, Mel.
What percentage of women physically can't produce enough milk?
It's actually really quite small. I don't know the exact number, but it's well below 5%. Most of the time, it's individuals who have like a pre-existing medical condition, like you probably know. So like somebody who has polycystic ovarian syndrome, for example, those individuals are more at risk. There is some information that indicates that people who have a higher BMI or who have diabetes in advanced age, but often those are all mixed together. So I don't know that independently that each of those things are presenting like that, because we have, you know, there's individuals who are advanced age and have all kinds of comorbid conditions, and that's probably contributory. But then we have people who are, you know, advanced age but actually super healthy, and just, you know, just like all of our other organs are, you know, in decline, unfortunately, as we age. You know, the liver gets worse, the kidneys get worse, then, you know, potentially how you make milk potentially could get worse, but that's different for everyone. So just sort of deciding that maybe somebody is in that category, and I guess being aware that it could be an issue. One thing I didn't talk about in this first week, just sorry to sort of take a side note, but just before I forget, is that if you've had a baby before, and you've probably noticed this already, like people's milk comes in, seem to come in a little bit earlier, and, you know, there's more dexterity and comfort often with like handling babies. So once you make, I discussed this in the first talk, but since nobody on this call was in that one, once you make a lactocyte, like once a lactocyte's created in your breast tissue, and that's going to be milk producing, they don't go away, they stay. So when you become pregnant again, they're there, and they basically, you know, are ready to go and start making milk. So what you've noticed is actually physiologically true. Like those milk cells are there, and they start making milk way sooner because of that. And they're more responsive because they've been responding before to the hormone changes that are happening. So you will definitely notice that. I got on that track because I was thinking of advanced age, and then I was thinking about how, you know, as we get older, if we've had more than one child, like that it doesn't hold true. Like you're still making milk, and sometimes faster, and it's because you've already had babies before and those lactocytes are there. Another thing that does seem to have a really good correlation to milk not being made maybe on schedule is having had a C-section. That often will cause a delay in milk coming in, and I don't know the exact reason for that from literature and writing, but it sort of makes sense to me that if your body's trying to make milk and trying to like heal itself from a C-section, that it would be difficult for your body to expend energy in both directions, but certainly it does. And we know that people who've had C-sections still breastfeed. So, but sometimes it can be delayed sometimes for that reason. Where people are sometimes making milk, but milk isn't coming out is with like breast reduction surgeries. Sometimes there's nerve damage, or there's just structural things with scarring that can happen. So those are people who might be more at risk. Hopefully those individuals and like the other people that I've mentioned who might be more at risk of having issues with milk creation and or like ejection of milk, getting that transfer to happen, Hopefully they've been identified prenatally so that there's some planning in place for them. But if you're in a position and you know like nobody's like noted this or done any work with it, that's really something that you can be mindful of, and that's because you won't notice in the first 24 hours because everything's going great. But probably they're going to go home, and if they don't have a plan already, they're going to be in big trouble. And so if you have, I know not everybody has access to a lactation consultant, but if you can consult with someone on that, if you don't feel like comfortable creating that plan, that would be a really great gift that you can give that family before they go home and have trouble.
And folks can also call MaBAL, which is the RTVS line. Am I right, Joyce, if there's like a lactation issue, is MaBAL able to answer those kind of questions?
Yeah, so the MaBAL line can collect them. If the person on the line can't help, we've had presentations from different lactation consultants. I'm on the MaBAL line, obviously, because I'm here. And so there's people that can be accessed to assist with that. It might not always be like in the moment assistance, because they might not be the person who's actually on the line for MaBAL that day, but certainly can help direct that call. Thank you, Rebecca. That's a great plug there. Is there a lactation consultant in Smithers, Lindsay?
There is, yeah. There's 2, I believe.
Okay. And do they often get, are you aware if most people who are coming to the hospital who might have lactation issues already have plans in place, either through them or in consultation with providers, because you have 2?
I'm not sure people are. You can actually book through one of the doctor's offices, and the lactation consultant works out of there, so you can actually go in and see her as an appointment.
Right.
When I do discharges, I often kind of mention that there's one in the community, but they're not pre-booked. And if women are struggling in the hospital, we'll call them in to help.
That's perfect. That's kind of what happens here too. You can book to see somebody if you need to. And if something's identified in the hospital, then the lactation consultants will go in. There's 2 in our community too. So there's myself and one of the physicians who offer lactation consultation. The physician on our team has been a lactation consultant for a really long time. She's such a great resource. Yeah, and I think one of the things that I really appreciate about her is that because she's on the team of us when we're seeing people prenatally, she does a really great job of identifying people. So hopefully it doesn't get to the point that they get to the hospital and there's like no plan when there's something known going on. But I think it's like good preventative sort of strategy for sure. But I understand that's not always easy to organize. Sometimes needs to happen afterwards. I didn't have anything else to like present today, but if there's any other questions, either related to like the first week or something different, if I don't have the correct answer right away here, I can always, like I said, send it out after. Did anyone have any questions or a case or anything that they wanted to talk about that related to breastfeeding that they wanted to share and maybe ask questions about, or just something interesting that you saw that surprised you?
My question was, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. My question was, because I live up on Vancouver Island, the north part of it, and we don't have a lactation consultant here. So I was just curious if it was okay if we could help our families connect with a lactation consultant through MaBAL.
Yeah, for sure. And like I said, if for some reason there's somebody who's not on the MaBAL line who can, so first of all, I guess it's the difference between like somebody who might have like a specific question in that moment. If there wasn't somebody who was there, they could connect that way. But if you think there's somebody who might have like just an ongoing kind of issue. The person on MaBAL might be able to connect you with a lactation consultant, like on a more regular kind of basis, where the lactation consultant can connect via Zoom. So like, for example, I myself, this isn't to try to plug for me, but I just know I myself, and there are some other lactation consultants who do consulting like just via Zoom like this through a secure kind of connection. It's, you know, you're missing the piece of the hands-on, but there's a lot of things that can be solved without having to actually put your hands on mom and baby. And honestly, it's actually really good, because then people who are doing the feeding are actually, you know, directing how they feel most comfortable holding baby and things like that. And sometimes that's a really good thing. If you need to have a baby examined, like their mouth, they look for tongue tie and things like that, that might be a little bit more challenging, but you can still do things on Zoom, like, and look and sort of try to do some preliminary things. If there's something that's sort of flagged and you're like, that looks like you might be having an issue there, at least the lactation consultant can say, yeah, you know what, it looks like there's something going on there. Should see someone in person, and to at least give you that piece of information.
Perfect. Thank you.
I think the first stop of the MaBAL line is a really good suggestion from Rebecca, because they can help to coordinate all of that.
I've also called, like, I've had more complicated cases in Smithers where I've actually called just bigger centers like Prince George, who might see more complicated cases. And the lactation consultants around other hospitals are very happy to help smaller hospitals.
That's a really great suggestion, Lindsay. I myself have called a Calgary center, because that's closest to where I live. There's a clinic and they're super helpful. So yeah, that's a really great use of resource too.
Yeah, and I actually think I called Prince George because this was a baby who was actually going to end up there in the next couple days. So I just kind of got a head start on the case, and yeah, it was really nice to talk to them.
That's awesome. Yeah, and there's some hospitals who have, like, I don't know, I think what you're saying, Lindsay, like in Prince George, they actually have lactation consultants on staff. Was that
Yeah,
the case?
yeah. So she was employed at the hospital like every day. Yeah.
I was gonna say that's an awesome point too, that there are centers that have that resource, which is really handy.
I just wanted to thank you for sharing this, and curious because we just had about 20 doulas complete a doula training program. And I feel like this would be really useful information for them, because we have quite a few who support families through labor, birth, and then postpartum. So is it okay if we share the information and recording, or?
I'm okay with that. If you guys are okay. I guess, well, we won't be able to see you, but you'll be able to hear the questions potentially. And I guess it would also have to be okay with MaBAL, but myself personally, I'm okay with that.
I'll post this to the MaBAL page, this recording. There's other recordings already on there. And then it's sort of public. So whoever watches it, it's up to them.
Awesome, thank you.
And just to be clear, if you are asking a question and speaking, you will be on the screen. Sorry, I wasn't clear about that, but unless you're off camera, but it's not like the whole gallery is on the screen at all times. That's kind of what I was trying to say earlier. So Joyce will be the main person in the recording, but if you did speak up and asked a question, you may be on the recording. And if you feel shy and you don't want to be on the recording, there's probably things I can do to sort of blot you out, but hopefully everyone is okay. I don't think anyone asked anything too controversial.
Is this the part of the recording where we stop the recording and then people ask all the controversial questions?